Hi. I'm also recovering from a bit of a cold, so hopefully my voice will hold up for the next 30 minutes. So I'm going to be talking about content negotiation, specifically content negotiation for REST APIs. Just to give a quick introduction, my name's Erik. My handle across the internet is sferic. If you follow me, I'll post these slides on Twitter after the talk. I work at SoundCloud on the platform team. So SoundCloud is a music website. You can upload music there and share it. Other people can listen to it, stream it across the internet. And we have a public API. So we have pretty much since the beginning, we really consider ourselves to be a music platform, not just a music service. And people have built all sorts of creative, interesting apps on top of that platform related to music and audio. Not just music, by the way. We also host anything you'll upload. So sounds, podcasts. The President of the United States posts his weekly radio address on SoundCloud. There's all sorts of crazy content on there. I think something like every minute, we have 12 hours of audio uploaded. So in the time I've been talking, there's like a whole day's worth of audio that you couldn't possibly listen to if you wanted to. Just a bit about sort of my history. As I said, I've been working with APIs for a while. And back in 2005, this was the state of the art. This was the type of API I was working on. It's a SOAP in German. It's a SOAP API. And then in 2007, this book came out, and I read it. I suspect most of the people in the room have read it. Can I actually get a show of hands? Okay, it's actually less than half, fewer than I expected. Cool, so I'll go pretty quickly through the next few slides, but not so quickly. So this book had a big influence on me. I think it had a big influence on the industry. It was a bit of a turning point. The book came out in 2007, and within a year or so, that was pretty much the turning point for when SOAP overtook REST. REST overtook SOAP, at least in Google popularity. So this is using Google's trends. These are basically people searching for these terms, REST API versus SOAP API. It's also interesting to note that while the red line has been steadily increasing over time, the blue line has been basically flat, right? It hasn't gone away. We start off with basically nobody talking about REST. Fielding publishes his dissertation, people start talking about it. The book I mentioned comes out, more people start talking about it, and it's basically taken over, but that blue line hasn't gone away at all, really. And I think this gets to the point a number of previous speakers have mentioned around it's really hard to turn APIs off once you put them out there. So SOAP APIs still exist, and they will probably continue to exist forever. But most of us have accepted that REST is a better design, sort of because Fielding says so, and because Fielding created the protocol that we all use, HTTP, and it's like the most successful protocol ever invented and things like that. So when Fielding says you should do it that way, most of us listen. We've been listening since 2007, maybe a few of us a bit earlier than that. And I think he's right. And I just want to go through quickly why I think SOAP REST is better than SOAP. So to boil it down to a simple example, this is what a SOAP request might look like. You typically have a single endpoint, and you're making a remote procedure call by posting to that endpoint. And most of the data about the request you're making is contained in some sort of XML body that you're posting to that single endpoint. So there's a couple, I think, obvious things wrong with this. The first is that you're using the same endpoint for every request. So this sort of throws away the whole concept of URIs. As unique, every resource has its own unique identifier. Nope, with APIs, we're not going to do that. If we use SOAP, we're just going to have one resource for everything. That seems bad for the web, right? The web doesn't work like that. The web has different resources, different URIs for every resource. And the second thing that I think is misguided about this approach is that it sort of uses post for everything. Post is just kind of your general thing. And then if you have details about what you want to actually do, what remote procedure you want to call, that is contained in the XML body. So yeah, like it just doesn't make sense, right? Like we have this thing at the protocol layer, we have verbs at the protocol layer, but we're just ignoring those. We're just going to always use post, and then like override that in the XML body. So like you would use post even if you wanted to delete something or get something. Seems wrong. So this is what an equivalent REST request might look like. So yeah, it's basically just like working with the protocol instead of like creating this unnecessary RPC layer on top of it. And again, just to sort of call it out, instead of using a post for every request, we're actually using the HTTP the way it's intended. So it's a little bit like an Occam's razor, right? If you have two solutions that can do the same thing, you should prefer the simpler of the two. And in this case, if we use get here, then, or if we actually use different HTTP verbs when we want to do different things, we don't have to repeat that information somewhere else. We don't have to specify that information somewhere else in the XML body. We can just specify it once using the HTTP verb. And remove some complexity, remove some duplication. And the other sort of benefit of REST is we're sort of using the URI as it was intended to identify a resource, right? So at some point, we sort of switched from preferring XML to JSON, neither here nor there. But yeah, this is sort of just every resource has its own URI instead of one URI for everything. So there's one part of the URI I haven't talked about yet, which are these file name extensions. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to go on a brief rant about these things. So the three-letter file name extension, it's sort of a relic of CP/M, which is an operating system that predated DOS. It's sort of, because it made it into DOS, it made it into early version of Windows, and because it made it into early version of Windows, it made it into late version of Windows, because Windows never breaks backwards compatibility, and then because like Windows was a monopoly, like the Mac needed to be compatible with it, and other systems needed to be compatible with it. So basically every modern operating system uses these file name extensions in one way or another, right? Like they might not be significant, but we tend to still use these. They're very prevalent in operating systems and file systems. And despite the fact that they're completely unnecessary, right? So there's like new file systems and like, Unix has never really needed these things to know what type of file a file was. But just because like Windows has been so dominant and because it had this DOS legacy, we are sort of stuck with these things. And so like then the web came along in 1995, again, like long after these were no longer necessary. And we just put them on the web, right? Because like the web is just a big file server. Wrong, right? But like we just sort of like copied these things to the web because we had them in Windows and that's what was going on at the time. So I think that's, like I hope I can convince you that these things are bad, and they're bad, again, for the same reason. Like they're unnecessary, they add complexity. Yeah, they're just ugly. So how do we get rid of file name extensions? So you need to understand the difference between resources and their representations, right? So on the web, we can have the same resource. Here's an example. So this is an XML representation of me on some service. And you can represent that same user in an entirely different format, right? So here's a JSON representation of the exact same data. And so I would argue that these two representations of the same resource should have the same URI, right? Because the format is like, what you're saying when you make a request for this data is you're saying, I want this resource, I want this entity. And you're like, you basically like, the way that different clients or the way that you might want to represent that entity might change over time, or it might change from client to client, right? You might want that a different representation of that resource on a mobile device versus on a desktop device, or you might want a different representation of that resource on your old, yesterday's device versus today's device or something like that, right? It might change over time. And so like these things, like even though typically we represent them with different URIs, I think they should have the same URI. So if they should have the same URI, like how do we know which one to serve up, right? So we have all these different clients with different capabilities. How do we know which one to give them? Some of them maybe support XML, but not JSON. Some of them support JSON, but not XML, or they prefer JSON to XML. Maybe they support both, but they have some preference. How do we deal with that? So yeah, right, we get rid of these file name extensions because that's redundant. We can just have this, right? And those two resources, they're actually just one resource, right? They're two different representations of the same resource with one URI. And there's been something built into HTTP since version 1.0. It's in the specification under the headers section, and it's actually listed first, the accept header. I like to believe that it's because it's the most important header. You might think that it's because it's alphabetical. We have different opinions about these things, but it's really important. I think you should all know about it and use it. Yeah, so this is the accept header, and this is just copied from the RFC. The accept request header field can be used to specify certain media types which are acceptable for the response. Easy enough. So again, just to sort of draw a parallel to the redundancy that we saw in SOAP requests, in SOAP, right, you had this redundancy in the verb, right? You were sort of like always using post as your HTTP verb, and then you were, specifying a different sort of action in your procedure call later on. I think this is similarly redundant. So when we make a request, in this case, it's for an avatar with, like for the user with my screen name, we typically send an accept header. The browser, the client, however you're requesting this, is requesting it with an accept header. And the accept header looks something like this. So it says, I want this resource, avatars sferic.png, and I accept PNGs. So this is redundant. And I think we can drop that .png from the resource name. And what's nice is if you read the RFC, if you understand the protocol, you can actually specify multiple formats that you accept, multiple representations. And so there's this Q parameter, which basically says how much do you prefer that format relative to others. And it's always going to be a value between 0 and 1. The default is 1. So here I say my strongest preference is for a PNG, but if you don't have a PNG, I'll take a JPEG or a GIF. And if you don't have any of those, I'll take whatever. If you can just give it to me as an image. Like, just try whatever other image format you have. Maybe I can handle it better than nothing. And then I'm also specifying that I accept application JSON. And so maybe there's an error or something like that, right? Maybe the image is not found. And in that case, I would actually be willing to accept a JSON response and handle it that way. So this is quite cool. And like, when you think about it, like if this resource is going to return JSON, which it might if it's not found, it doesn't really make sense for there to be .png in the URI. Okay, so here's another example of a service that supports video avatars, right? So maybe your service over time, like it used to just like trends change, right? Today on the web, most of us just have like these static avatars, but in the future, maybe we'll all be using video avatars. Who knows? It's the future, right? So if you want to start supporting video avatars, and you're doing it this way, it's really easy to evolve your API, right? Nothing needs to change. All you need to do is like the URI stays the same, and then the clients that accept video, the new clients that are capable of handling a video in response, say, I support videos, right? And then maybe if a video isn't available for this particular resource, maybe the user hasn't uploaded a video avatar, maybe they're still using the old static image avatar. we'll still accept a GIF. So maybe there's like an animated GIF or something like that. That sort of is a stand-in for the video. Otherwise, again, any other image or JSON. So maybe you think this is sort of a far-fetched hypothetical example. So let me talk about a practical example. There's also this accept language header, right? By the way, this process is known as content negotiation. The title of this talk has content negotiation. This is content negotiation. So the client sort of says what it supports, what it accepts, and then the server basically like responds saying either I have that or I don't, and if it has it, then it'll give you back what you ask for according to your preference. So another example of content negotiation is the accept language header. Again, this is copied right out of the RFC in the same section under headers. Just below the accept header, the definition for the accept language header, the accept language request header field is similar to accept, but restricts the set of natural languages that are preferred as a response to the request. So you see things like this all the time. There's some resource like index.se.html, where SE is a language, right? So the English version might be .en, German version might be .de. But the browsers, most browsers, send along an accept language header. And obviously API clients can do this as well. And so yeah, like forget about the .html thing. We've already talked about that. That's superfluous. We can get rid of that. But typically people who use this pattern of just like stringing things together with dots will throw the language in there as a way to specify it. Again, completely unnecessary, right? So most operating systems or clients that people use have some way of specifying their preferred language. Again, like maybe they can sort of have a rank order so that you can specify different languages to different extents. So here's an example of that. We just have the resource index, and we say, okay, we prefer Swedish. That's our top language preference. If you don't have that, I'll take a US English version. And if there's no US American English version, okay, give me any old English, British English, Australian, whatever they speak down there. So again, this is just another example of content negotiation. We get nice, clean URLs, and we're not encoding the language of the resource into the URI, which I think makes a lot of sense, right? So, like, I remember the first time I was in Europe, it was in the 90s, before the euro existed, and I was like watching TV late at night, and there was some infomercial on TV. And at the end, you know how they have that like blue screen where they have like the price of the thing and like the phone number, like the toll-free phone number to call. And in the US, it's like a pretty standard thing that you see at the end of every like late night television infomercial. But in Europe, it sort of blew my mind because like they basically had like, instead of one price and one toll-free phone number to call if you wanted to order the thing, they had like 20 different prices in 20 different currencies and 20 different toll-free phone numbers to call if you wanted to order the thing. And so like this whole screen was just a mess, and like the fonts were really small, like you couldn't even see it. And it basically was terrible. And I think like when you do things like index.se.html, you're doing the same sort of thing, right? Then in all your marketing material, you have to have different marketing material for every language, right? So like you have to generate different marketing materials when you're advertising your site in Sweden versus advertising it in Germany. Where if you just have it like this, then it's one URI. People can request it the way they want and get the right thing back just based on their capabilities and preferences. So here's some real-world examples of this. This is from the Travis CI blog from a few months ago. Travis CI, for those who don't know, is a continuous integration server. So you push your code to them, they run the tests, and they tell you if it passes or fails. And they have these little badges that look something like this. And it basically is just a build status badge. So it tells you the current status of your build, whether it's passing or failing. And they put out this blog post a few months ago saying that the status badges now support SVG. And I'm going to quote, read, it's probably too small for you to read, but It says, for the time being, we'll still serve the PNG files on the old URLs. So the old URLs are ones that end in .png. But we'll eventually serve the SVG version by default for both URLs. So again, to sort of like keep backwards compatibility, they're serving an SVG version even if you request .png, right? Which is a really good reason not to sort of encode the file formats into your URLs, because you might want to drop support for them at some point, and then you have a URL that ends in .png, but it serves up a .svg. It just doesn't seem right. So again, like there's new formats all the time. Google created this WebM format, and for basically like to be an alternate media format. And they also created, like for videos, WebM, and then they created this sort of similar complementary one called WebP, again, for photos on the web. They haven't really taken off, but Google's been pushing them, and who knows, like they support them in Chrome. Maybe if like they start using them, you know, on YouTube. I think they actually have started using WebM for YouTube videos, for some videos at least. And so like, you know, just because of sort of like the size and momentum that Google has, they can drive a lot of these decisions about formats, and they change all the time, right? So this is like relatively recent history. These formats didn't exist 5 years ago. Now they exist, right? So if your API is more than 5 years old and these formats really take off, like people want content in like WebM or WebP, you need a way to evolve that. You need a way to evolve your API. This is new too. So Twitter started supporting animated GIFs. When is this from? Is there a date on this? I guess it got cut off pretty recently, though. I think earlier this year, Twitter supported animated GIFs. And the way they support it, they don't support it via the API yet, by the way. But the way they support it is by taking an animated GIF that somebody uploads and converting it into a video, because it's more efficient to actually serve it as a video than each frame as an image. There's like compression benefits, right? So like this is another example of just like formats changing over time. I saw this one just the other day. So Imager, I think is how you say that. They're announcing this new format called GIF-v, which again, it's like a GIF video format for hosting animated GIFs in a very efficient way on the web. This blog post is from October 9th, so really just a couple weeks ago. And so yeah, like formats change, right? Like there's new formats introduced all the time, and your customers, your users, your clients will want you to support these formats. You'll want to support these formats because they're more efficient, right? You'll save in bandwidth costs and things like that if you support them. So yeah, like maybe yesterday you wanted to return a PNG image. Today you want to return an SVG for the same thing. You know, not long ago, PNG was like the hot new format on the web because it had lossless compression. Like I remember when PNG, like it was really exciting that we had PNGs in addition to GIF and JPEG. So yeah, like Google's pushing WebP, maybe that'll take over. You know, for representing text, like XML used to be the trend. Now it's JSON. Maybe in the future it'll be like EDN, this extensible data notation that Clojure and Datomic are using. So right, like we don't know. It's very hard to predict the future of formats, and formats change all the time. They get better, right? We have better compression algorithms and things like that that aren't supported. So yeah, like we should basically design our APIs to allow us to evolve this as easily as possible, because it's so hard to remove APIs, right? You don't want to get rid of old APIs, so you end up doing things like serving an SVG at a .png URI, which just seems wrong. I'll just sort of wrap up with a quote from Fielding, and I think this is great. So he says, REST is software design on the scale of decades. Every detail is intended to promote software longevity and independent evolution. Many of the constraints are directly opposed to short-term efficiency. Unfortunately, people, developers, us, API developers, are fairly good at short-term design and usually awful at long-term design. Most of us don't think they need to design past the current release, right? And I think this is exactly a case of that happening, right? Today, the only formats we need to support are PNG, so we'll just add .png to the end of the URI without really thinking forward. And then a new format comes out, and we don't have a good way to evolve that, to move forward. So yeah, that's sort of my recommendation to you. Most of us have moved beyond RPC to embrace at least some aspects of the REST architecture. But this is like one area where I think almost everyone has failed. And basically, yeah, like we should be exposing resources, not specific representations of those resources, which means we shouldn't be encoding the file format into the URL. Right? It's a uniform resource identifier, so URIs should be resources. Okay, these slides are online at this URI without a format at the end. Thank you very much.